Hi, this is my final video in this series going through the Integrity Commission report on Prime Minister Andrew Holness's statutory declarations. In this video, we look at the discussion of findings in the report. Thanks for being here. I'm Dionne Jackson-Miller. Stay tuned. Okay, as I said, this is a final video. We'll be looking at the discussion of findings. Let me just say a couple of things. Now, one, I notice people have been saying, Dionne, why aren't you doing some analysis? Why aren't you telling us what you think? That's not what this particular series was about. Here, I'm just putting on videos information that's in this big document that I know a lot of people won't get to read, even though they may want to know what is in it. So this particular series was purely an informational video. All right. So I do get you on to hear, what do I think of this? What do I think of that? I'll be making some additional videos that go into that. But this set of videos is purely informational. I do realize that it may not be useful for some people. Some people may not be interested in that, and that's fine, because I do all kinds of videos in which I go into different things. All right. So that said, let's get to it. So the director starts by looking at what he calls facts that have been established and are not in issue. In other words, nobody in a quarrel about this. This is what it is. So these are the following facts he looks at. That Mr. Holness was required to file a statutory declaration for the year 2021 and other relevant years. Mr. Holness did file those statutory declarations. Particular bank accounts were omitted, left off of those statutory declarations. C. Mr. Holness has/had financial interest in 3 companies, Imperium, Positive Media, and Estate Bridge, with sole ownership of Imperium. He's the only owner of Imperium, and he still has control over the finances of Imperium. Between January 2021 and December 2022, Mr. Holness was the sole signatory on the 2 bank accounts owned by Positive Media, both of which were opened by him. Mr. Holness's son, Andrew Matthew Holness, replaced him as signature on those accounts on December 23, 2022. Between January 11, 2021 and November 15, 2022, Mr. Holness, as CEO, Managing Director, Executive Director of Estate Bridge, was the sole individual authorized to act on its behalf in respect of its NCB Capital Markets account. On November 15, 2022, Mr. Holness was removed as a signatory on all of those companies' accounts on the basis that Imperium, that's the company of which he is sole owner, was no longer a majority shareholder. Nil tax returns were filed for those companies for the years 2021 and 2022. So those are the facts that have been established that are not in dispute. So the director goes on to look at questions raised that he says have to be determined. A. Whether Mr. Holness's omission of bank accounts from statutory declarations amounts to making false statements in those statutory declarations contrary to the Integrity Commission Act. So let me just say that I'm not going to be going into this any further because of the fact that the Director of Corruption Prosecutions has ruled that there is insufficient evidence to lay any charges against Mr. Holness in relation to this particular issue. You can go back to my very first video on the summary and the conclusions and recommendations, and I do go into that. So I'm not going to go into that further in this video. Another question he raises, whether having regard to Mr. Holness's income and liabilities, he owns assets disproportionate to his lawful income, contrary to the Corruption Prevention Act. C. Whether the nil returns filed by the companies in which Mr. Holness has an interest breach the Income Tax Act. D. Whether there were any irregularities relating to a loan of $50 million obtained by Mr. Holness from Barita Investments. And E. whether the operations and financing of Positive Media, Imperium, and Estate Bridge and Green Emerald give rise to any concerns. So issue 1 is that issue of the false statements in statutory declaration. So he goes through what he looked at and why it is he referred the matter to Director of Corruption Prosecution. As I mentioned, I'm not going to be going into this because this matter has been concluded insofar as the Director of Corruption Prosecutions has ruled that no charges be laid. So we move on to issue 2, illicit enrichment. And he said he looked at the following. Now, he looked at the law in terms of what illicit enrichment says. Where a public servant owns assets disproportionate to their lawful earnings, and if they're requested to do so, fails to provide any or sufficient justification for how they came by that assets. So you're talking about somebody who works in the public service, who owns a bag of things that they don't seem to have been able to buy based on how much they earn. If they're asked to explain how they managed to buy the bag of things and they can't explain it or they don't have a sufficient explanation, they can be held to have committed the offense of illicit enrichment. All right. He then goes into how you prove illicit enrichment, which is by way of a mathematical calculation, and that the person in question, as I mentioned, hasn't given an explanation or a satisfactory explanation, and that explanation has to be supported by evidence. So I'm going to go down now to what he says are the facts. Now, the director says he was not in a position to determine illicit enrichment using that mathematical formula, which is called source and application. He said to do so, the director would need to determine the total amount of funds applied towards the acquisition of wealth or assets or saved over the relevant period. He said this was not possible as the director was not provided with a schedule of Mr. Holness's expenses for the period. He says Mr. Holness was asked to give that schedule of expenses but refused to do so. Now, Mr. Holness has said that that is not true. The director has directed us here to Appendix 5. So I'm just going to go down to Appendix 5 so we can see what is there. Okay, so I am not seeing an Appendix 5. So I do see an Appendix 4. So this seems to have been an error because Appendix 4 says income and expenditure statement sent to Mr. Holness. And that seems to be what the director is talking about here. And this Appendix 4 is on page 169. So that appears to be a clerical error there. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. The report goes on to say, additionally, the director would need to ascertain the total amount of funds that Mr. Holness was able to put towards the acquisition of wealth or assets or accumulated as savings that have come from known lawful sources. He says the questions around the operations and funding of the 3 companies with which Mr. Holness is associated will also need to be resolved. Intercompany transactions among the companies were found to be as follows. A. Total deposits of over 473 million, and B, total withdrawals of over 427 million. He says the interplay between Positive Media and Imperium is of particular concern. Deposits totaling over 52 million were made to Positive Media's accounts over the period. Breakdown: Imperium 51.3 million and Positive Media 1.5 million. Over the same period, withdrawals were made from the accounts of Positive Media in the sum of 71.7 million. The breakdown of the withdrawals is as follows. Imperium 70.1 million, Positive Media intra-account transfers 1.6 million. A total of 18.8 million more was withdrawn from Positive Media accounts than was deposited. The director says he was, however, able to perform a net worth analysis based on that information. And this is a net worth analysis. He says the majority of Mr. Holness's assets are held in Imperium, a company that he indicates was established for that purpose. It can therefore be inferred that the assets, liabilities, and income of Imperium are those of Mr. Holness, as the company is wholly owned by him. The assets, liabilities, and income held between Mr. Holness and Imperium must therefore be combined for the purposes of this investigation. B. Before combining the assets, liabilities, and income of Mr. Holness and Imperium, it's useful to examine the assets, liabilities, and income held in Mr. Holness's name. When the assets, liabilities, and income held together in Mr. Holness's name for the years 2021 and 2022 are taken together for the purpose of computing his net worth, meaning how much he owns, assets minus liabilities. So the amount you own minus how much you may owe is your net worth. And he says a result of negative 10.4 million and negative 5.3 million are returned respectively. So for the years 2021 and 2022, there was no unexplained growth in relation to Mr. Holness's net worth. He then looks at the combined assets and liabilities and income of Mr. Holness together with Imperium, which is the company that he owns. So he says no, the director merged both sets of assets, liabilities, and income. He made further adjustments to correct for fluctuations in exchange rates and the changes in value of assets due to appreciation. A mathematical calculation showed changes in Mr. Holness's net worth of negative 1.1 million between 2020 and 2021 and 1.9 million between 2021 and 2022. In other words, there is no unexplained growth in Mr. Holness / Imperium when you take both of them together in their net worth that was detected for the year 2021. There is, however, unexplained growth of 1.9 million for the year 2022. The director says he then invited Mr. Holness to provide an explanation. Mr. Holness's explanation was provided over a period of several months between August 2023 and 2024. The director reiterates his inability to proceed with illicit enrichment calculations in respect of Mr. Holness's assets, liabilities, and income, the unresolved questions around connected companies, and the absence of a schedule of his personal expenses over that period. He was asked to provide this information by May 31, 2024. Mr. Holness wrote to the Commission on July 16, 2024 and said this: "On the advice of my attorneys, I have complied with the Integrity Commission Act by submitting the required information in the form. This was done when I filed my 2021 previous and subsequent declarations. Further, subject to the objections sent by my attorneys for your attention, I have responded to the questions that have been asked. I adopt and incorporate all of the objections, including that at the commencement of the investigations, no allegation of corruption was put to me." Mr. Holness says, in addition, "I was not told, nor was it established, that my assets are disproportionate to my lawful earnings. In response to the inquiry as to the reason the matter was referred to investigation, I was told some new matters had arisen. However, I was never told what those new matters are." So Mr. Holness is saying here that he had answered all the questions he had been asked, and he said also he's objecting to the fact that this allegation into illicit enrichment was started and he wasn't told what was going on. Having regard to Mr. Holness's response, the director says he's highlighting a few paragraphs from a notice dated August 18, 2023, which was served on him during the investigation. It says, "Take notice that the Integrity Commission is investigating the statutory declaration submitted by you for the year 2021 to determine, inter alia, among other things, whether there are reasonable grounds to suspect that you have contravened Section 14.5 of the Corruption Prevention Act, Section 43.2 of the Integrity Commission Act, or any other enactment, and whether recommendations ought to be made. Take further notice that the Commission, from the proceeds of its investigation so far, has determined that you own assets disproportionate to your lawful earnings, insofar as have been declared by you." Goes on to invite him to come to an interview to answer questions. And the notice goes on. The director further notes that on meeting with Mr. Holness and his legal team, he opted to make written submissions instead of being interviewed. The written submissions were made on at least 4 separate occasions, the last of which was July 16, 2024. Mr. Holness's written submissions have been referred to throughout this report. It's important to note that during the course of the investigation, Mr. Holness was provided with documentation, including bank statements, identifying specific assets for which he needed to provide explanations as to the source of funds used to acquire said assets. The next subsection is called an asset of particular interest, which is the $94,000 bond. The director says the explanation provided by Mr. Holness in respect of the source of funds for this bond is not completely supported by the transactions in his bank account. Mr. Holness explained that the bond purchased on September 2, 2019 was funded by a withdrawal from SSL and accumulated funds in his bank accounts. The director notes 2 checks of over $30,000 and over $42,000 withdrawn from SSL on September 5, 2019. Only one of these checks could be traced to ADMAT/Mr. Holness's SSL account at the time. Mr. Holness's bank account reflected only one transfer of over $31,000 to NCB Capital Markets, so he was asked for an explanation. The director says the explanation provided by Mr. Holness was inconsistent with the evidence from NCB Capital Markets. Mr. Holness said the $94,000 bond was incorrectly assigned to him by Capital Markets and that the correct allocation to him was over $61,000 based on withdrawals from BNS. He said this explanation is also contradictory to Mr. Holness's own explanation. Statutory declarations previously provided to the director and to the commission, and the manner in which the proceeds from the bond and the principal has been appropriated by Mr. Holness from the date of acquisition to June 2024. Initial checks made by Capital Markets revealed they were investigating the source of funds for the bond purchase. On June 17, 2024, the office at NCB Capital Markets indicated that Capital Markets had received a total of 4 payments, and the information on the 4 payments is now on the screen. The director reiterated below the findings made above based on inquiries made of the officers at Capital Markets after getting Mr. Holness's July 16, 2024 response. The bond purchase agreement, duly signed by Mr. Holness, clearly indicates the value of the instrument to be $94,000. The officer at NCB Capital Markets confirmed that this is what was relied on by them in relation to the number of units to purchase on his behalf, that is $94,000. NCB Capital Markets has indicated it only takes written instructions from clients in respect of bond instruments. Mr. Holness is presented with statements of account on a regular basis, clearly showing the value of the instrument, that is $94,000 in addition to interest. Mr. Holness has not before June 2024 indicated that his intentions were not the intention shown in the bond purchase agreement. NCB Capital Markets has indicated that the bond was called early and the proceeds and principal transferred to Mr. Holness's holding company Imperium on September 22, 2020. No corrections can therefore be made to the bond agreement as it was originally crafted. It no longer exists. The actions taken by NCB Capital Markets on behalf of Mr. Holness on June 24, 2024 were therefore based on fresh instructions from him and not a correction as he stated in his July 16, 2024 response. The evidence indicates that on October 21, 2020, adjustments were made to Mr. Holness's account on the basis that funds belonging to Positive Jamaica Foundation were erroneously deposited in the account. This transaction was reversed on October 26, 2020. There was no indication at that stage or any other stage that the $94,000 bond was incorrect and should instead be about 61,000 US dollars. There was no indication of this, the director is saying, before he started to ask about it in June 2024. And the full proceeds of the 94,000 US dollar bond, including the about 32,000 US dollars, which is now said to belong to Positive Jamaica Foundation, the full proceeds were transferred to Imperium and reinvested by Imperium. In other words, the director said, the portion allegedly belonging to Positive Jamaica Foundation formed part of Imperium's assets for over 3 years and was appropriated by that entity as it deemed appropriated. The funds were only sent to Positive Jamaica Foundation after inquiries were made by the director. He said all those issues raised concerns as to whether Mr. Holness's alleged use of funds belonging to a charitable foundation to partially fund the acquisition of a personal asset amounts to misappropriation, and the director finds that in the circumstances an investigation by the Financial Investigation Division, FID, is warranted. So he then goes into tax compliance concerns. He said in 2021, Imperium earned at least $5.1 million in dividend, exchange gains, and interest according to the financial statements provided by Mr. Holness. But Imperium filed a nil tax return for 2021 and 2022. Positive Media also, according to Statement of Comprehensive Income for 2021, indicated total income of about $20 million, but Positive Media also filed a nil tax return for 2021 and 2022, indicating that the business had not engaged in any revenue-generating activity over the 2 years of its existence. Estate Bridges' Statement of Profit and Loss account for the year ending December 2021 showed interest income of over $1 million, but also filed a nil tax return for 2021, meaning the business had not engaged in any revenue-generating activity for that year. The company known as Green Emerald provided loans to Positive Media to the tune of $20.6 million and appeared to be in operation during the period. But Green Emerald also filed nil tax returns for 2021 and tax returns declaring income of $355,000. The director says in those circumstances, he finds that there is sufficient basis to make a referral to the Commissioner General of Tax Administration and the Financial Investigation Division for a determination to be made as to the appropriateness of the filing of nil tax returns and whether there is any financial impropriety on the part of those companies. He said on a preliminary assessment, the tax returns filed by Green Emerald do not demonstrate that this company has the income generating capacity or has generated enough income to be in a position to loan Positive Media over $20 million within the time frame that it did. Issue 4. Prudential concerns in relation to Burrito. He's looking here at a loan of $50 million that was acquired through Burrito by Imperium, which is wholly owned by Mr. Holness. As a collateral, the loan was hypothecated on about 10 million Derrimon Trading shares, a first legal mortgage on land purported to be owned by the borough, and the assignment of the fire and peril insurance policy. The director's inquiries revealed that at the time of obtaining the loan, Mr. Holness did not own 10 million Derrimon shares. The evidence shows that $24.9 million was used to purchase the Derrimon shares on March 31, 2021, while $24.7 million was transferred to Imperium's NCB account. The loan application documents indicate that a property owned by Imperium was used as collateral for the loan, but the property was not transferred to Imperium's name until November 10, 2021. Also, the volume and folio numbers were incorrect and were not attributable to the property at the material time. No mortgage was registered against the property purported to have been used as collateral for the loan. Also, an insurance policy was said to be assigned to the loan, but there was no evidence unassignment seen. So the director is saying here that that documentation on an objective assessment would not be registrable if Imperium defaulted on the loan. He says it's highly likely that in such a case, Barita would have to amend the documents to secure its interest. Mr. Holness's assistance as principal of Imperium would almost certainly be required to make that possible. The question is, the director asked, would a person who defaults on a loan be willing to secure that loan after the fact? The consequence of this state of affairs is that an unsecured loan of $50 million was provided to Imperium where a secured loan was intended. Based on all of that, the director is saying a referral to the Financial Services Commission is justifiable to determine whether the practices of Barita are consistent with the Financial Services Commission Act and regulations and the terms and conditions of the license under which Barita operates. The director says the Integrity Commission Act empowers him to monitor and investigate licenses and permits issued by the government of Jamaica, but given the remit and resources of the Financial Services Commission and the exigencies of this investigation, the matter concerning Barita's license is being referred to the Financial Services Commission. Issue 5. Operations and financing of companies connected to Mr. Holness. The director says he considered the following. Mr. Holness is connected with or had financial interest in 3 companies, Imperium, Positive Media, and Estate Bridge. A forensic examination of the bank accounts showed intercompany deposits of $473 million and intercompany withdrawals of $427 million. Deposits of over $250 million were made to Imperium's accounts over the period. And you can see the breakdown on the screen. He then says deposits of $52.9 million were made to Positive Media's accounts over the period. You can see the breakdown there on the screen. He says within the same period, deposits amounting to $170 million were made to the accounts of Estate Bridge. Again, breakdown is on the screen. You can just pause it and go through that if you want that detail. He says Imperium is wholly owned by Mr. Holness and is a holding vehicle for his assets. Imperium is a successor company to ADMAT, a company which was set up for a similar purpose in St. Lucia. Mr. Holness's residence and all other substantial assets are held in Imperium. The company makes investments as well as acquires loans. Mr. Holness retains control of Imperium's finances. Imperium has made investments in 2 other companies with which Mr. Holness is or was connected, Estate Bridge and Positive Media. Positive Media is a company set up by Mr. Holness to, among other things, manage his image. There were initially 2 shareholders, Mr. Holness holding 99 shares and Marcus Zahn holding 1 share. Mr. Holness forfeited his shares in 2022, which are now held by his son, Andrew Matthew Holness. Marcus Zahn remains a shareholder. Positive Media is said by Mr. Holness to be funded through Imperium. The evidence, though, the director says, does not support this. He says Positive Media has made transfers totaling over $70 million to Imperium over the period. Transfers from Imperium totaling over $51 million were also seen. This leaves a surplus of $18.7 million in Imperium's account. An examination of tax returns, nil, filed by Positive Media does not suggest that Positive Media generated sufficient capital to be able to provide the loan amount mentioned. He says this raises questions as to the operations of Positive Media and whether the director is in possession of the full facts. He says in any event, it's something that requires a thorough investigation by FID. Meanwhile, another company, Green Emerald, is said to have provided loans totaling over $20 million between 2021 and 2022 to Positive Media. A total of $24.9 million was transferred from Positive Media's accounts to Green Emerald's account, $4.3 million in excess of the loan amount. No explanation was provided for the surplus. Also, the director says, having looked at the nil tax returns and tax returns submitted by Green Emerald for the years 2021 and 2022, he says they do not suggest that the company is generating the level of income that would support it providing loans of over $20 million to Positive Media. So the director says, based on all of that, referrals to the Financial Investigation Division and Tax Administration Jamaica are justifiable in the circumstances. He says it will need to be determined by FID and THA whether those companies are operating within the law and whether recommendations ought to be made to any other authority. Okay, so that's it. It's been a long haul. I know it's been a long report in all. I mean, I've been telling you the report is 171 pages. This part of it goes up to page 148. Remember, I did a separate video with the summary and conclusions. That's the very first video, and that's a much quicker watch if you want to just get the gist of what this report has said. So that brings us to the end of this series. There are lots of other issues involved, though. I am going to be doing a video raising questions that I think the Integrity Commission needs to answer. The Integrity Commission is going to be appearing before the Parliamentary Oversight Committee. Certainly I'll be covering that as well and giving you a summary and some comments in terms of what happens there. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Dionne. I'll see you next time.